What if I told you that no matter how many times you've tried and failed, you could build the planted tank you've always wanted by following a simple blueprint? I'm going to share the exact setup I followed to turn an empty tank into this. Whether you're going the low-tech, no CO2 route or a full pressurized CO2 system, these fundamentals will work either way. So here's the first step, the equipment. For this build, I'll be using a standard 20-gallon tank. The reason is due to the amount of space it gives me for aquascaping, and it's large enough to keep water parameters stable. For the lighting, I went with the 60cm Chihiro's A2 because of full tank coverage, and it pushes a stronger red output in its light spectrum. This makes it a contender for growing deep red stem plants. It's also one of the more budget-friendly premium lights on the market. Its app controllability and tiltability are bonuses, but if you're only growing low-tech plants, you could get away with even cheaper options. Now, a lot of people will fixate on Kelvin ratings, also known as color temperature, but that really only affects how the tank looks. These two fixtures are rated at 6500 Kelvin, but have different light spectra. Instead, we focus on PAR, which tells you exactly how much light your plants can use. The only accurate way to know PAR values is to purchase very expensive equipment, trust the manufacturer data, if any, or find third-party data elsewhere, such as this website. If you want a deeper dive on lighting, check out my full breakdown linked below. Now, this is where you will need to make an important decision, as it will change the trajectory of your aquarium. Low-tech or high-tech? In other words, CO2 injection or no CO2 injection. For this specific setup, I will be using CO2 and therefore will have a high-tech tank. Of course, this also comes with higher maintenance requirements. And if you're still stuck on the fence, I also have another video about this topic. As for the filter, I went with this cheap Vivor canister filter. Canister filters offer you a lot of room to store filter media, which will help when it comes to water parameter stability, but are way more expensive. Just don't buy the cheapest option like I did. For the background, I use translucent stencil sheets, also known as Mylar sheets. This gives you a very nice smooth finish compared to frosted window film, as they may leave small bubbles here and there due to their frosted texture. However, these will be more pricey and may not fit the width or height of your tank. Side note, if you want to make the sheets or film stick to the glass better, use a mixture of glycerin and water or just straight glycerin. Glycerin will adhere to the glass better and won't dry up if there's an air bubble. Now, we can start prepping for our aquascape. So, get out a piece of paper and a marker. We are going to start drawing.
Okay, it's happening! Everybody stay calm!
Or look for inspiration. If you need some, I have a video that goes over common aquascaping styles. Either way, here is where we can experiment with different layouts. But first, we need to take a few lessons from photography. You'd be surprised on how large of a role photography composition plays. First is our focal points. These are your rule of thirds, golden triangle, S-curves, and the well-known golden ratio. The rule of thirds is the easiest composition method to use. These intersections are potential focal points. You can use eye-catching plants or hardscape in this area. Of course, you don't have to use every intersection, but you can combine different compositions. My drawing uses both the rule of thirds and the golden triangles. I'll also be using red plants as the main focal point, all while following the slope of the triangles. Don't think too much about what plants you will use just yet. Just get a general idea of what you want the aquascape to look like. But I can't draw. No worries, Scapeit.io is a 100% free browser-based sandbox that lets you drag, drop, and tweak aquarium plants and hardscape within seconds. And yeah, it uses plants that are commonly found in aquascaping. You can even have custom tank dimensions, layout helpers to help with more precise layout designing, and even a grow out mode. They just released version 3.0, so check them out in the link down below. Now here's where things start to get dirty. Literally, your substrate of choice is the base foundation for plant health, and there's a lot to choose from, especially when it comes to substrate additives. These are added before the main substrate. Consider it as the base layer. Here, we want additives that help with root growth, nutrients, and beneficial bacteria development. For nutrients, I sprinkled in some Osmocote Plus pellets. These are a cheap option when it comes to fertilizer, despite them being made for terrestrial plants. I've also added 2 tabs of ADA Bottom Plus and 2 tabs of ADA Iron Bottom. These are planted in areas that will be heavily planted, such as crypts. Realistically, you don't need to add these expensive of root tabs and can opt for cheaper options. Of course, there's also that risk of adding too much, which might give you a little issue later on.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Now here's where things get interesting. I added activated carbon pellets. Whoa. Isn't that going to absorb all of the nutrients? Exactly. A certain degree of nutrients will still exist in the activated carbon, which can be a nutrient source later on. Furthermore, it's very porous and can be a house for beneficial bacteria, all while helping keep the water crystal clear. This is the methodology that 88 Clear Super uses. Another alternative would be to use crushed tourmaline as a replacement for 88 Tourmaline BC. Now, to supercharge my substrate even further beyond, I added a layer of Safety Sorb, an oil absorbent. Or to be more accurate, this is Montmorillonite clay, or however you pronounce that. The reasoning behind this is the same as activated carbon, to absorb nutrients that plants can use later on due to it having a high CEC rating. This is also a reason why I added more fertilizers than needed, as this is more of a long-term plan.
Foreshadowing.
Alternatively, you can use 88 Power Sand or Tropica substrate, but those are much more expensive. As for the main substrate of choice, I went with Aquario Neo Aqua Soil. It's a dual-layered aqua soil made out of volcanic soil, very porous for bacteria, requires no rinsing, and can grow carpeting plants. Well, every aqua soil can do this. But the main reason why I got this one instead of the popular 88 Amazonia is due to availability and pricing. The amount I get is way cheaper than high-end aqua soils. Just be aware that powdered versions are much finer, as these are more specialized for plants with small root systems such as carpeting plants, and are generally more expensive. If you're curious to know alternatives for planted tanks, I have an in-depth video guide for this. As for how much to add, the safe range is around 2 inches. Personally, I like to shoot for 3 as I find it to be much easier to plant in. Anything more than 5 inches will start to get pricey. To compensate for that, you can use other materials such as lava rocks or even use leftover gravel. But what about mixing aqua soil brands? Don't worry, it's fine. There isn't a big impact other than consistency. I even used some leftover aqua soil for this setup. Now onto the fun part, aquascaping. This is where we will refer back to our original drawing or any other inspirations that we have. With this, we can start to source our hardscape. For the wood, I went with spiderwood as it has that flowiness that I'm looking for. Alternatively, manzanita wood is another option. Yeah, I could scavenge some driftwood, but you need to make sure that it's the right type of wood and is properly disinfected. The same goes for the rocks. I chose Oko stone, also known as dragonstone. These rocks are inert, which won't affect water parameters, unlike calcium-based rocks. If you want to know more about hardscape material, here's another 101 guide. There is a concept called depth. Basically, it's a tool to trick your brain into thinking that there's distance. One method that I use for every aquascape is to slope the substrate so that it's shallow at the front and higher at the back. It's similar to how roads or railways look like they shrink in the distance. It's basically a forced perspective. This slope lifts the background higher up in your field of view, making the scape feel like it stretches further back. Without it, everything looks flat, especially if you end up creating an L shape. If you look at the aquascape from the side and see something that looks like an L or a sharp 90-degree angle, it will instantly throw off the illusion of depth, which again is why we want that gentle slope. Now, if you cram your hardscape too tight against the glass, whoever is going to clean it is going to have a bad time. Maintenance will be much harder, as it can be tough to get cleaning tools into those areas. Furthermore, the height of your plant also plays a role with depth. Obviously, using shorter plants and then tall plants immediately right behind it may look off to some people. The same goes for massive plants near the front, surrounded by smaller ones, but this isn't a required rule. Some tanks will utilize smaller plants near the back to give more depth of field, and that leads us to the importance of plant selection. Here is where I break things down into zones or layers. It will be easier to visualize things from above, but the main idea is to group certain plants together according to how they grow. You've got the foreground, midground, and background. Sure, you can split the tank into thirds, but it depends on the aquascape. Each grouping can also be considered its own zone. There's also something I like to call accent plants. These are plants that act as a subtle filler to fill in the void. They're not the main attraction, but they help accentuate the main plants in that zone. It's a subtle way to break up uniformity, as symmetry is less common common in landscapes. Anubias or other epiphyte plants are a few examples of possible accent plants. I also want to point out that there's no shame in adding plants later on. There could be a plant that you didn't know of that would suit the aquascape better. Moreover, some plants might end up melting and may need to be replaced. This also leads into another question. How many plants should I buy? My general rule of thumb is to plant as heavy as you can from the start. This way, you have a better chance of outcompeting algae early on, thus making the tank stabilize faster. That said, the amount you can get varies from potted plants to tissue cultures. A general rule is a single tissue culture cup can fill about the size of an open palm or roughly 10 by 10 centimeters, while potted plants can range from 6 to 8 stems, depending on the vendor and plant species. Basically, any areas where you plan to use plants should be 80% covered. It does not matter if you have a low-tech or high-tech tank. Stability is the key. That is, if it's all within your budget. If this isn't possible for you, there is a trick that can help you get a head start. A trick I like to call the dry start method. This method takes advantage of atmospheric CO2. You plant directly into moist substrate, skip the flooding, and cover the tank with a humidity dome. We are essentially creating a terrarium. To sound more corporate, this root-first methodology prioritizes robust root development prior to the introduction of water, ensuring a strong foundation for long-term growth and stability. We also need to make sure that the soil remains moist, so we have to mist the tank every day without creating puddles, as that would be prime targets for algae growth. For the lighting, we will need to run it for a full 10 to 12 hour cycle to maximize photosynthesis. And if done correctly, you may even be able to skip the nitrogen cycle. But that's not always the case, especially if you make the same mistakes that I did. Not every plant will work in a dry start. For example, I used Blixia japonica. All it did was just melt into oblivion, nowhere to be seen. The reason is because this plant, like many others, are true aquatic plants. These are plants that can never grow out of water and will always melt if attempted. This dead matter can throw off the balance of the dry start. Stem plants are also iffy. As time goes on, they may start to develop immersed growth. Once you flood the tank, they still have to transition to their submerged form and still have that chance of melting. This is clearly redundant, and the only benefit is possibly growing an extra stem or two. Moreover, dry starts require a minimum of 4 weeks to take full advantage of. Although, that can be a good thing as it gives you plenty of time to further gather equipment or wait for any plant shipments to arrive. But there's also the threat of mold. High humidity with low airflow is a prime environment for mold growth. If left unchecked, it can possibly harm plants and others who are allergic to mold. We can fight this by using mold busters. But let's cut to the chase. Is this even worth it? In a nutshell, DSM is your friend for heavy carpets and a low risk of algae growth, as long as you're fine with waiting 4 to 6 weeks and daily misting. Otherwise, it might just be better to flood the tank immediately or do a dark start. Dark starts are tanks with substrate and/or hardscape that are cycling in the dark. You see, beneficial bacteria doesn't need light to grow, just time, oxygen, and a source of ammonia, which is exactly what aquasoil releases. This entire process can be difficult to keep track, which is why I created Planted Tank OS. This is a Notion template that I made that helps you keep track of your equipment, plants, tank setups, and more. Link below. Anyway, it's time to get the equipment ready and flood this big boy. Once the tank is filled, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. The first one is lighting changes. If you're coming from a dry start, chances are that you have it full blasting the boys 12 hours a day. Obviously, this will cause algae once flooded, so I changed mine to 70% power for 7 hours. But the main idea is to start low and then work your way up if needed. During the first 2 weeks, we will need to do daily water changes of 50% or more. This is especially true if you're using aquasoil. If you don't do this, the amount of ammonia that can build up has the potential to injure plants and livestock with ammonia burn. However, we can speed things up by using beneficial bacteria in a bottle. And yes, these do work, but not all of them are the same. The better method is using seeded filter media. This is filter media from an established tank. They're already full of beneficial bacteria ready to work. Of course, you can use both at the same time. But what about fertilization? When do we start? Personally, I will always start to fertilize day 1. This gives plants all of the available nutrients from the start. However, this can be a bit overkill and can cause algae if you dose too much. This is especially true when it comes to the dosing method and initial fertilizer in the substrate. More information about fertilization methods in the link below. Now, it's a different story if you're pumping CO2, as you want to start dialing it in immediately, and the best way to do that is with a CO2 drop checker. These devices have an indicator fluid that changes color based on the amount of dissolved CO2. However, it will take about 30 minutes to an hour for any changes to be reflected. This is where we have to be a little careful to not stress out the plants. So start slow, check the checker, adjust, and repeat if necessary. Oh, and don't bother with bubbles per second. It's unreliable considering how many different variables that can affect it. I only use them as an indicator to know that there is constant CO2 flow and that I'm actually injecting CO2 in the first place. As the tank nears the end of the nitrogen cycle, this is where things may start to get out of control. You might start to see some plants melt, but that's to be expected. Potted and bundled plants are usually in their immersed state and will have to transition. Tissue cultures are also not immune to this as they are a bit more fragile due to how they're grown. Which of course, if you don't remove the debris, it can build up to the point where it starts to feed algae. So, if you start to see this kind of algae, don't panic. This is also expected at the start. These are diatoms, a brown algae that loves to feed on silica. Fortunately, they are light enough to be removed with an air hose, provided that you don't suck up plants or aqua soil in the process. These aren't a super big threat, as they only last a few weeks and disappear on their own. But here's where things can get a little bit tricky with plant maintenance. Trimming plants can seem easy to do, but if you trim too early, you could risk killing your plants. I've had countless plants die because I thought it was safe to do so. Once again, we have to keep waiting until we start to see more robust growth. This is usually around the 3 to 4 mark as it gives ample time for root systems to develop, although some plants may establish faster than others. For example, this Votala orange juice is at the point where I can safely trim it lower, replant it, and not have it get overshadowed by other plants. However, when I prematurely cut my Glossostigma carpet, I accidentally exposed their root systems by trimming too deep. Now, you're probably wondering why I trimmed them in the first place, and that was to remove as much algae as I physically can. The tank started to develop a dense amount of staghorn algae, some of which developed on plant leaves. It got thick enough to the point where it started to block light, which in turn can kill that leaf, which in turn again gives something for algae to feed on, and thus begins the endless cycle. Algae-covered leaves don't provide much for the plant and is better to trim them off. This makes the plant focus more energy on growing new ones. But why not just add more shrimp and snails? They will eat it up. Yeah, but no. Algae eaters are a bandage solution and are there as a preventative measure. The same can be said for chemicals. If you don't solve the root cause of the algae, it will come back to bite you. And of course, if you want a more in-depth playbook on algae management, here's another video. Now, the equipment is also not immune to cleaning. Algae can grow just about anywhere. Scrapers and brushes are your friend when it comes to physical removal. And if you have lily pipes, get one of these specialized snakes and be careful not to shatter it. You'll also need to clean the tubing as gunk can accumulate on the sides. As for the filter, you don't need to clean it as often. Usually every 4 or so months is suffice, or if you start to see a change in flow rate. This tank is not perfect in any way whatsoever. There are still issues that I'm currently dealing with, such as the return of a large amount of staghorn algae. So this isn't the end of this tank's journey, as it's still yet to reach its peak. And in order to unleash its potential, we have to understand tank balancing. So if you're wondering where to go from here, take a look at this balancing video.